Well, the first thing Judge Juan Merchan did in the courtroom today, before bringing the jury into the room or bringing the witness into the room, was to rule in favor of Donald Trump on an evidentiary point. Donald Trump pretends that never happens. He stands in the very hallway of that courthouse, right outside the courtroom, speaking to microphones every day, ranting about how unfair Judge Merchan is. He appears to hate Judge Merchan and is very convincing in delivering that feeling. But he cannot hate the judge because the judge is unfair. He has to hate the judge for some other reason. Even Donald Trump knows that the judge is fair. Today, half of the Trump lawyer objections were sustained. And there weren't that many objections because the trial was proceeding fairly under Judge Merchan's guidance. But the judge did say something today that we know enrages Donald Trump. It was in the round of the judge's good mornings to the lawyers on both sides. He said, "Good morning, everyone." And then he said, "Good morning, Mr. Trump." And of course, Mr. Trump is blasphemy to the man who demands that his lawyers and everyone around him call him by his former official title. Good morning, Mr. Trump. It was not a good morning for Mr. Trump when Michael Cohen took the witness stand to testify against him. Witness Cohen delivered all of the essential elements of the criminal charges against Donald Trump in his testimony. District Attorney Alvin Bragg was watching from the spectator section on the prosecutor's side of the room after being publicly called Fat Alvin by Donald Trump at his rally in New Jersey this weekend. At that same rally in New Jersey, Donald Trump said he could not call former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie a, quote, fat pig. Could not call him that. Said it out loud, of course. The deep perversion of Trumpism that is on display in moments like that is that extremely overweight people at Trump rallies, and I mean even more overweight than Donald Trump, laugh at that use of the word fat as if they are living on some other planet where harsh adjectives only apply to people they don't like and can't possibly apply to themselves. Such is the madness of Donald Trump, which apparently contains enough contagion to infect many millions of his followers. Michael Cohen was once one of those followers. Before anyone ever thought of voting for Donald Trump, Michael Cohen's view of Donald Trump was close to worshipful. According to his testimony today, Michael Cohen felt, quote, "I was on top of the world when Donald Trump told him it was fantastic." That was Donald Trump's word, fantastic, that Michael Cohen got vendors who did work for fraudulent Trump University to accept 20% of the amount of money Donald Trump actually owed them for work done at the university. The word fantastic came up 4 times in Michael Cohen's testimony, always quoting Donald Trump's reaction to good news, often involving the cover-up of bad news about Donald Trump. According to Michael Cohen's testimony, Donald Trump thought this was fantastic. A cover story in the National Enquirer titled, "The Donald Trump Nobody Knows!" The National Enquirer let Michael Cohen edit that article as part of the Enquirer's deal with Donald Trump to publish positive stories about him and terrible stories about his political opponents, and to catch and kill any stories about Donald Trump having sex with women other than his wives while married to those wives. The word that we heard in court almost as much as fantastic today was catastrophic. That's what Michael Cohen called the Access Hollywood video that showed Donald Trump bragging about his favorite methods of sexual assault. And that's what Michael Cohen said Stormy Daniels' story would be if it became public before the election. Catastrophic. And so, in the final days of the presidential campaign of 2016, a scheme was hatched to buy Stormy Daniels' silence. According to Michael Cohen's testimony, Donald Trump told Michael Cohen, quote, to take care of it. Question: And did you ask him at that time whether he had had a sexual encounter with Stormy Daniels? Answer, I did. Question, did he answer you directly? Answer, no, ma'am. Question, what did he say? Did he say anything in response to that? Answer, no, ma'am. Question, did he mention anything about what she looked like? Answer, he said she was a beautiful woman. Donald Trump repeatedly told Michael Cohen, quote, just take care of it. We kept hearing that line today over and over again. According to Michael Cohen's testimony, Donald Trump said, quote, this is a disaster, total disaster. Women are going to hate me because this is really a disaster. Women will hate me. Guys may think it's cool, but this is going to be a disaster for the campaign. That's what Donald Trump thought the Stormy Daniels story could be, a disaster for the campaign. Michael Cohen quoted Donald Trump saying, quote, what I want you to do is just push it out as long as you can. Just get past the election, because if I win, it has no relevance. I will be president. If I lose, I don't even care. Question, did you bring up at the time the topic of his wife, Melania, in one of those conversations with Mr. Trump? Answer, I did. Question, what did you say to him in substance to him? Answer, I said to him, and how's things going? How's things going to go with upstairs? Question, were you concerned about that? Answer, I was. Question, and what, if anything, did he say to you about that? Answer, don't worry. He goes, how long do you think I will be on the market? Not long. Question, what did you understand that to mean? Answer, he wasn't thinking about Melania. This was all about the campaign. Michael Cohen on the witness stand is like Donald Trump in AA. Michael Cohen was once, in many ways, as bad as Donald Trump, threatening people, acting in a gangster-like way. But on the witness stand today, he was a different person. And he said something Donald Trump would never say, could never say. He used a phrase Donald Trump could never use. When Michael Cohen talked about wanting to at least be considered for White House Chief of Staff, which he admitted he was not qualified for. He said that he just wanted to be on the list, kind of publicly on the list. He wanted people to think he was being considered for the job of White House Chief of Staff, quote, solely for my ego. That is a line Donald Trump could never speak, solely for my ego. It explains everything Donald Trump does, every breath he takes, but Donald Trump could never admit anything like that, the way Michael Cohen admitted that today. That is the new Michael Cohen, who sees his ego now as one of the problems that drove him in a criminal direction with the egomaniacal and unrepentant Donald Trump. Michael Cohen on the witness stand today in the courtroom was unlike any version of Michael Cohen you have ever seen. He was not fighting back at the questions and being belligerent the way he was when he appeared on TV in 2016 as a campaign surrogate for Donald Trump. He was not sounding like the gangster he wanted to sound like when he was calling up reporters then and threatening them during that first Trump presidential campaign. He was not making fun of Donald Trump or taunting Donald Trump as he has done so frequently and recently on social media. It was not the emboldened Michael Cohen who has turned against Donald Trump and publicly attacks him. It was Michael Cohen, the lawyer, knowing how a witness should sound on the witness stand, calm, deliberate, careful, clear, sometimes vivid. As the 6 hours of testimony were on, Michael Cohen became more comfortable on the witness stand, and more importantly, perhaps, the jury probably became more comfortable with him. Every courtroom becomes a community in a multi-week trial like this, with the same people coming into the room every day. And Michael Cohen became the new neighbor in that community today. He was not the fool that he had been in the past. He was not the monster that he had sometimes been in the past. He was, for those Manhattan jurors who will judge this case, very much one of them. Everyone living in Manhattan knows a guy who looks and sounds like Michael Cohen. Most of the guys we know who look and sound like Michael Cohen don't have criminal records like Michael Cohen. They don't have a dark criminal past like Michael Cohen. Most apartments Apartment buildings in New York have a guy or several guys like Michael Cohen who you can run into on the elevator at any moment and exchange a cheerful greeting. The jury did not look perplexed by Michael Cohen, but this jury is especially good at not giving away the slightest hint of what they are thinking. Michael Cohen, more than any other witness who has testified in that courtroom, delivered his testimony directly to the jury today. At all the right times when it could be effective, Michael Cohen physically turned toward the jury a little bit, turned his head and his eyes to them to deliver his answer directly to them, creating the effect of someone trying to help the jury understand. Given the wild range of public behavior we have seen from Michael Cohen over the years, the prosecution could not have delivered a better version of Michael Cohen to this jury today. The real test will come when cross-examination starts tomorrow. If Michael Cohen can maintain the sober tone he set today, if Michael Cohen can maintain his calm, deliberate response in the face of attacks, then this case will go to the jury as solidly as the prosecution could hope for. Michael Cohen has at times been a horrible person, but the jury also discovered today that he is the son of a Holocaust survivor who made it to this country and fulfilled his dream of living a better life here. The jury discovered that Michael Cohen is devoted to his wife, his son, and his daughter, and that Michael Cohen now lives a life full of regrets. And what was Donald Trump doing during Michael Cohen's testimony? 10 minutes into the testimony, Donald Trump closed his eyes, tilted his head back, probably trying to communicate to us, I couldn't possibly be falling asleep at 9:40 a.m., so don't consider my closed eyes to be proof of sleep. His eyes are closed in the course of the day much, much longer than anyone would reasonably close their eyes for any purpose other than sleep. And his head tilts to a side sometimes and slumps. When Donald Trump's eyes were open today, I could see over his shoulder that he was frequently reading from typed quotes of public commentators supporting him. The top name on the page that I could see him reading was Mark Levin in bold print, the right-wing commentator. And underneath that statement by was a statement by Mark Levin made about this case that Donald Trump liked. And below that, the bold print name of Andrew McCarthy was there, a lawyer who said something Donald Trump liked about this case. If Donald Trump's defense lawyers came up with this plan of handing him, in effect, fan mail to read during the trial, it has worked brilliantly. Because to the jury, it looks like the defendant is maybe examining some important documents in the case because they can't tell what's on the other side of those papers that he's holding up to his face to read. And those comments that Donald Trump spent the day reading endlessly, praising him and attacking this case, are the perfect behavioral corrective tool for Donald Trump in the courtroom. It means his eyes are open and he's reading and he seems alive instead of a sleeping baby. And these papers that he holds up to read work with all the power that a pacifier brings to a 2-year-old. They keep him under control. The courtroom has 4 60-inch or so TV screens around the room which show exhibits when they are discussed. And the rest of the time, those screens show 4 different video shots of the courtroom. The top of the screen is occupied by one box of video showing the judge and another box of video of a much closer focused shot of the witness. And the bottom of the screen has a box on the left of the screen showing the district attorney's table of lawyers and the podium for the attorney who's asking the questions. And then on the right side of the screen on the bottom is the Trump defense table, which requires a much wider shot because it has an extended piece which includes additional lawyers. And there is a band across the bottom of the screen under that wide shot that includes the date written out, May 13th, 2024. And under the prosecution box, that side of the video screen, it says New York State Unified Court System. On the right side of the bottom of the screen, right below Donald Trump, it says New York County Supreme Criminal. That is meant to be the description of the kind of courtroom you are in. But every day, Donald Trump spends his day on those TV screens, apparently without ever noticing the powerful irony of the words he is sitting on top of on those screens all day. New York County Supreme Criminal.